In the name of Allah, most merciful, most compassionate, I would like to welcome you all at King Abdulaziz at this workshop entitled Global Security Trends and the Nuclear Threats. Our guest is Dr. Smith, the Director of Stockholm for Peace Research, and he is an analyst and scholar, and he has long record about on conflict, and he is now working on the relation of insecurity and climate change, and also the security in the Middle East and the international conflicts. And he was the leader of Oslo Institute from 1993 to 2001, and he was the General Secretary of International Alert, and he served about 4 years at the advisory group for the Peacebuilding mission, and he presided over it from 2011 to 2017. And he also served as Professor of Peace and Conflict at Manchester University, and he authored a book on the peace in the world and a blog of the international security. Now he has the speech.
So, thank you very much for coming this evening and for inviting me to make this presentation to you. It's a great honor for me, and it's also of great interest. I come here not simply to talk about what I know, but also to hear your opinions and questions and your thoughts, and to learn from that as well. So my topic tonight is global security trends and the nuclear threat, and asking then what responses are possible. To look at global security trends at the moment is not a very comforting or joyful thing to be doing. For 20 years after the end of the Cold War, from 1990 until 2010, the world became a more peaceful place. There were 50 armed conflicts approximately active in 1990, and by 2010 there were 30. Peace had been made in many of those conflicts. Peace had been made durable, it was sustained, it was continuing. Today we are back to a level of about 50 armed conflicts. So the number of armed conflicts in the world is back at the level it was at the end of the Cold War. And in that sense, the post-Cold War peace is over. Armed conflicts also tend to last longer these days. If we go back to 1970, nearly 50 years ago, and think about the armed conflicts that ended then, their average length had been 10 years. Of the armed conflicts that ended in 2014, their average length was 25 years. So there are more armed conflicts, and they are tending to last longer. It's difficult to put figures on the costs of armed conflict. We all know there's a human cost to armed conflict. In terms of people who are killed, estimated to be 400,000 who have been killed in the Syria conflicts, for example. We know that the number of displaced people, refugees and internally displaced people, is the highest it has ever been, at 65.6 million people at the end of 2016. And there was a threefold increase, a tripling in the number of internally displaced people, refugees who haven't crossed national borders, in the last 10 years. And the economic figures are harder to count. But a reasonable estimate in the recent study done by the World Bank and the United Nations together is that the average cost of an armed conflict today is $35 billion to $70 billion per year per conflict. So the global total in any year is $3.5 trillion, perhaps, as high as that. And the cumulative cost of these armed conflicts over years is an enormous amount of wealth being wasted. Neighbors of the countries which have armed conflicts also suffer. GMP in a country neighboring one with armed conflict declines by over 1% a year on average, and inflation also increases. And meanwhile, the proliferation of armed groups in these armed conflicts also makes it harder to bring them to an end, harder to manage. On average, at the beginning of the current era, in the early 1950s, there were 8 or 9 armed groups involved in each armed conflict. Today there are 1,000 involved in Syria, there are 2,000 involved in Libya, and while those are extreme figures, nonetheless, in other countries as well, the figures are also very high. So that's on the conflict scene. Other indicators also are not positive. Military spending rose sharply in the first decade or so of this century. It's now kind of on a plateau. But nonetheless, military spending at the end of 2016 was 14% higher than it was a decade earlier. The increase in 2016 over 2015 was very small, less than 0.5%. But the increase over the decade is 14%. The arms trade has expanded. Arms transfers and value has increased. In the 5-year period to the end of 2016, it was over 8% higher than it was in the previous 5-year period. Arms transfers now are on a higher volume than in any 5-year period since the end of the Cold War. On nuclear weapons, on weapons of mass destruction, there is in some sense better news. First of all, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the disarmament agreement for chemical weapons, is being implemented. And just a couple of weeks ago, the last of Russia's chemical weapons left over from the Soviet period were destroyed. The US still has some, but the stock is declining as it's destroyed. The number of nuclear weapons in the world is also declining. At the peak of the Cold War, there were some 65 to 70,000 nuclear warheads worldwide. Today there are just under 15,000, and the number is steadily declining by agreement. However, there are now 9 nuclear weapon states. North Korea, which I will come back to talk about in a few minutes, became effectively a nuclear weapon state, confirmed its emergence as that in 2016. All of the other 8 nuclear weapon states, as well as Korea, North Korea, are upgrading their nuclear technology, their nuclear weapons programs. Arms control agreements are still existing, and that's why the number of nuclear weapons is being reduced. But they're getting rather uncertain, and there is no forward progress currently being made in arms control talks on nuclear weapons. And if we look at other military technology, what we see is a continued forward march of military technology. We have been talking about missiles and drones. The next step is robotics. Drones which command themselves effectively. And it is seen realistically in some circles of advanced weapons development that it will be possible to produce weapons and deploy them in some maybe 3 to 4 decades' time, which are able to operate both for defensive but even for offensive purposes in very active military environments. Beyond robotics, of course, there's cybersecurity. And that is something which is exotic for many people, but it's a reality now. Quite recently, a senior British politician made the statement, which everybody nodded their heads at wisely, that in the next war, the first act of that war will be in cyberspace. But those who are really in the know shook their heads and said, no, it's already happened. And cyber war has already begun. There are Russian experts I have read, seen quoted, who comment about the problem that cyber warfare, cyber offensive and defensive operations really obliterate our old-fashioned notion of the difference between war and peace because of the kind of attack that happens. It's not kinetic, it's not using artillery or bullets or guns or planes or missiles, and yet it's an attack, and it's silent, and it can't always be seen where it comes from. And we've seen so many examples of different kind of cyber attacks being made in the last few years, some publicized, some not. The background against which we need to understand these issues that I've been talking about is a world which does seem to many people to be in a particularly unstable state at the moment. Now, when things are unstable, that's not necessarily and in every sense bad news. Because when things are beginning to change, there are opportunities then for improvement. But nonetheless, there are difficulties, obviously. I see three quite long-term, very long-term global trends that it's worth drawing attention to when one's thinking about conflict and security today and into the future. The first is that there has been rising levels of inequalities within nations over the past 45 to 50 years. And time after time, when we explore and try to identify how did an armed conflict come about, how did disputes escalate into violence, how did the violence get organized parties, not just on the government side, but on the side for an insurrection, what one finds is the grievance of those who are recruited to the causes of violence. And many of those grievances are to do with social, economic, sometimes cultural and political, sometimes ethnic and national and even religious discrimination and inequalities. The second big global trend, I think, or global issue, is to do with competition for natural resources, both in a kind of localized level, where people and communities are competing with each other for access to good farmland, for access to good clean water supplies and so on. And also in a more international dimension, where because we consume so much of our Earth's natural resources, we are consistently hunting for new possibilities and needing to exploit the natural resources of new areas. And the third big pressure that I see is the impact of climate change. It is still not a 100% scientific consensus that anthropogenic climate change, that's to say climate change caused by humans, really is happening. But to my mind, the evidence is very clear. Climate change is happening, and we are seeing the consequences of that. And we're seeing the consequences of it in extreme weather events, and we're seeing the consequences of it in shifts in the climate in different localities, different places. Longer droughts, monsoon seasons that change their timing, typhoons that hit in different places in Southeast Asia, the increasing intensity of hurricanes in the Western Hemisphere. And I think that climate change builds on the other pressures. In an unequal society, or in a badly governed society, the impact of climate change is going to be very severe on the poorest, those with less opportunity, those with less access to wealth. They are the ones who will suffer most. They are the ones who can be mobilized by, in the cause of a party, in the cause of a political movement, which perhaps becomes violent over time. It isn't the case that climate change causes armed conflict. Armed conflict is not ever caused by just one thing. But it is the case that climate change increases the pressure on already fragile societies, sometimes on governments which are stretched to the limit to manage, and it becomes the extra factor which is finally breaks things down. And this overall background of economic and environmental vulnerabilities is playing itself out at a time when patterns of political power in the world are changing, and changing in some ways quite dramatically. With the rise of China, the rise also of India, the return to the stage of a more assertive, more self-confident Russia, and I think a widely recognized relative decline in US power, and a kind of European semi-absence from the active stage of world politics. This is a world that needs cooperative solutions more than ever, especially on the environmental and the economic front, and finds it harder than ever to find them. This is a world which in some senses is getting bigger all the time. The world population passed the 1 billion mark in about the year 1810, the early days of the Industrial Revolution. It passed the 2 billion mark about 100 years later. And 100 years after that, it was 7 billion. And it's expected still to keep rising another 2.5 billion, maybe 3, until it reaches a peak. And that's more people consuming more for higher levels of individual wealth than ever before. At the time when the world population passed the 1 billion mark, a little over 200 years ago, it's thought that 2 to 3% of the world population lived in cities. It's now over 50% of the world's population lives in cities. And in lots of ways, cities are great. You know, cities are civilization. Cities are people coming together and working together. Cities are people living together. I'm a city person. I love cities. Cities are also economically efficient and economically productive. And that means that not just to build them, but in their operation, they consume vast natural resources. So all of the natural resource pressures are against a background of demographic change and are creating and generating social pressures. So as I say, this is a world that needs more cooperative solutions than it ever has. Against all of that background, hoping that you're not all feeling too dismal and gloomy so far, let me turn to the nuclear threat. As I remarked, the number of warheads worldwide is down, but the number of nuclear weapon states has increased. Now, nuclear proliferation, the spread of nuclear weapons, has not happened as fast as people feared it might do in the 1960s and 1970s. And one big reason for that is because there was a big push to get countries to adhere to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1970. With the continued modernization, well, first of all, the continued possession of nuclear weapons, and then the continued modernization and upgrading of those nuclear arsenals by 5 nuclear weapon states, the permanent members of the UN Security Council, who are all parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there has started to be, well, there has been for some time now, a growing impatience at the inability of those powers to fulfill a bargain that lies at the center of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty binds the parties to it to undertake negotiations to achieve nuclear disarmament at an early date. They still have nuclear weapons. They have fewer, they have far fewer, so they have made progress. But at the 2015 review conference 2 years ago, the review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there was so little progress made in the course of the conference that it was impossible even to agree a statement at the end that would simply outline what it was they disagreed about. They could not agree to disagree. That was how deep the disagreement went. That growing impatience at the non-implementation of Article 6 is part of what has produced the momentum for the Nuclear Ban Treaty, which was particularly mentioned and highlighted by the Nobel Peace Prize Committee with the award it gave last Friday to the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons. But I think that while that impatience about the failure to, or the non-implementation, the incomplete implementation, let's say, of Article 6, while that impatience is very understandable and is in the forefront of people's minds, perhaps to some degree at the moment, I think that when people talk about the nuclear threat, we're really thinking about a couple of things which are much more specific. I guess that eyes in Saudi Arabia have been quite firmly turned towards Iran on this issue. But from a global perspective, the more pressing issue right now is North Korea. Iran, it is feared by many people, may get nuclear weapons. North Korea has got them. Probably has 10 to 20 warheads by the end of last year, not deployed on missiles, but available to it. The world's 9th nuclear weapon state. It conducted its first nuclear test in 2006. At intervals of 3 and 4 years thereafter, it conducted 2 more. Then in 2016, it conducted 2 nuclear weapons tests, and another one, its 6th in all, this year. So there's been an extraordinary acceleration of North Korea's nuclear weapons program over the last 2 years. And the same is true with missile tests. It conducted 24 missile tests in 2016, and it has conducted 15 so far this year. And that is far, far more than it had conducted in the previous years. So there's been an acceleration of programs, and as far as can be told, can be seen from the trajectories of the missiles, from what happens to them, and so on. Although there were several failures in the missile tests last year, there's also been an acceleration in the progress of these programs. North Korea is becoming more and more technologically capable. This is in a context where there have been 9 resolutions to impose sanctions voted by the UN Security Council since 2006. And frankly, we have to say that whatever the reason and wherever we attribute the responsibility, were the resolutions not tightly enough worded? Were the resolutions not ambitious enough in the sanctions which they generated? Is implementation not adequate? Is the monitoring of the implementation failed in some sense? Whatever the reasons, one has to say that the policy of trying to limit North Korean nuclear weapons and missile ambitions through sanctions is not working. I will not say it has failed, because the policy has not stopped, but it is not working. So what are the alternatives? Tighter sanctions? Total sanctions? What are the politics of achieving that in the UN Security Council, of getting such a resolution voted through? Russia has already indicated that it has its reservations about that. China too. So political diplomatic pressure. So far, the regime of Kim Jong-un doesn't seem particularly pay much attention to that kind of diplomatic pressure. Military action. Well, if it's more than just gesture, then it would clearly be horribly dangerous. potentially actually illegal, an act of aggression, and with consequences. This has been widely discussed by many, many different, everybody has an opinion about this. But the options available for military action to terminate North Korea's nuclear programs don't seem to most observers to be realistic. The escalation in rhetoric seems only to add to the danger. If President Trump says very aggressive things about North Korea, Kim Jong-un says very aggressive and insulting things about President Trump, I don't see a solution coming through that. So is there a different way? And then let's turn to Iran. The Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Program of Action, restricts Iran for now. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, is the body which has the responsibility to monitor Iran's compliance to the terms of the agreement, and it confirms that Iran is complying with the terms of the agreement. The problem for the critics of the Iran nuclear deal is not, I think, rightly stated, whether Iran is actually complying with the terms. The IAEA seems to me to be the responsible and authoritative body, and it says, yes, it is complying. The problem for the critics is everything else about Iran. It's Iran's missile programs, it's Iran's actions in the region, it's Iran in Syria, it's Iran's support for Hezbollah. And it's a problem. And it's seen here as a problem. So my challenge, in a sense, or the challenge, not just from me, but the challenge is, yes, it's a problem. And yes, North Korea is a problem. What is to be done about these problems? Is intensified confrontation likely to achieve a secure, peaceful outcome? Or is it likely to come with very high human costs? If intensified confrontation either does not offer a solution or offers the risks of very high human costs, then we need to think about alternatives. And the fundamental question which we're facing here is how to manage relationships in difficult regions in a dangerous world. Now, the problems in Northeast Asia and the problems in this region are not the same, but there is that central principle at stake. How do you get secure regional relationships developing in a world which, as I've been saying, is quite dangerous? There is, of course, a possibility just to say, well, we must go for escalation. We must go for a build-up against those whom we oppose, against DPRK, against North Korea, against Iran, or perhaps from an Eastern European point of view, maybe a US point of view, you would say also against Russia, perhaps against China. Well, we've been here before. We know what worked then. We know how one of the world's biggest, greatest, and most dangerous confrontations between great powers that has ever been experienced in history, we know how that came to an end. And it was, in large part, not through heated rhetoric, but through diplomacy and dialogue. Not cutting off from each other, but by maintaining contact and exchange. If the problem with the Iran nuclear deal is that it's not good enough and it's time limited, well, perhaps it's possible to make a new one in the 13 years until it comes to an end. But probably not if, as many people are speculating, the current agreement is abandoned by one of the parties to it. It's difficult. It's always difficult to think how it's possible to talk with and listen to people or governments whom you find unreasonable. It's always difficult to think how to talk and listen to governments, or indeed to people, who you think are threatening you. But it has always been, and historically, one of the instruments of government is dialogue and diplomacy, is contact, communication, and exchange. At the very least, if you are in touch with your adversary, you have a better chance of understanding them. They're difficult tasks. It's entrenched confrontations which we're talking about. But difficult doesn't mean impossible. So, to my mind, the answer to the question which is posed in the title of my talk, what responses are possible, is a very traditional and modest proposition. And it is simply to do with seeing if it is possible to find ways to talk and listen, despite all the difficulties and complexities of doing that. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you for the very good exposition to a lot of history and geography at the same time. President Trump yesterday tweeted two very controversial tweets. I'm sure you're aware of them. I will read the end of the second one, which is, he said, agreements violated before the ink was dry, making fools of the US negotiators. Sorry, but only one thing will work. What is it that will work?
Well, I think we know what he is referring to rhetorically there. It's the use of force. But how the use of force is supposed to work and to achieve its end without excessive costs, that I think is not so clear. In one way, I have some sympathy with President Trump's arguments, including arguments he made when he was a candidate. Because he said this is a problem that has not been fixed. Right? And it wasn't fixed by administrations of both parties, and that's left me with a mess. But I can fix that mess. Right? It's when you get to this confident, I can fix that mess, that I sort of lose sympathy with his statement. Because I've been referring to it as a problem as well, but it's not a problem that you fix. This is not something where you flick a switch. This is not a car engine which has gone wrong and which you repair. This is a whole question about how to handle an extremely difficult and dangerous situation. There is, after all, still no peace agreement between North and South Korea. There is mutual distrust. Seoul is extremely close to the border. To the border with North Korea. It has an intense feeling of vulnerability when there are crises. So it is going to take a lot to do this. And up until about the middle of, well, maybe even up until the speech at the UN General Assembly, when he started to refer to Rocket Man and talked about total destruction of North Korea. Up until that point, I thought that you could interpret the US administration as following a kind of classic policy of talking tough but being ready to have a dialogue. They were constantly signaling that they were ready to talk. Now Trump seems to be undermining the Secretary of State, who keeps on saying that we're ready to talk, with a very, very heated rhetoric. And I don't see it leading anywhere at the moment.
Good evening and welcome to Saudi Arabia. I find it very useful and I appreciated it. I have a comment and a questions. You seem to concentrate on the nuclear and you talk about all the conflicts. There is a saying, which is I fully agree with it, is the marriage of democracy and capitalism have created an unsustainable economy that serve only 1% and have increased the huge gap between the poor and the rich. Saying all that, all these conflicts you're talking about, it actually have went and did a very good job for the 1%. The only good things about it is all the money is coming but nothing but a printing money. It's not really wealth, it's nothing but a paper money. And government just keep borrowing money, which is a paper money, and there is a cap for it. My question to you, the end of capitalism cycle as it is now, wouldn't you see that is a very big optimistic point, that is, it will make everybody reaching an almost a dead end because of the 99% just cannot keep 6% or 8% own more than 50% of an entire nation, like I'm talking about Indonesia. What is the perspective from a point of view of a financial crisis that this, what they call it, monkey business, cannot keep going like that? Thank you.
I guess I'm not at all enough of an economist or a philosopher to give you a question of the scale and depth that your answer deserves. I'm a person who looks at conflict and security most of the time, and I look at the balance of different political powers and social movements and so on. And what I would say is that the risk of, or rather, the prospect of a really profound destabilization in the financial, trading, and communications systems of the modern world would, I think, be extremely destabilizing and lead to a huge amount of conflict and insecurity. Whether on the other side of that there would be a positive outcome, I mean, history has many examples, especially in individual countries, but also, for whole continents, that after an enormous amount of destruction and pain, then comes the rebirth and the regrowth and so on. Whether there would be that rebirth and regrowth in the future, I am not, as I say, I'm not enough of an economist or philosopher to be really able to discuss. What I'm pretty sure about is that the costs along the way would be very, very high. So although I realize it puts one into a position of defending a system that generates inequalities, which generate conflict risk, I would rather that the current system persists than that it collapsed completely, because I think that, as I say, the cost would be so high.
هنا لدينا سؤال. أوكي. يقول إذا حصلت إيران على السلاح النووي أليس من حق العرب الحصول أيضا على هذا السلاح؟ مرة أخرى السؤال، إذا حصلت إيران أو تمكنت من الحصول على القنبلة النووية ليس من حق العرب الحصول على ذلك؟
Could you translate it into English, because I'm not picking up?
Okay, he's saying if the Iranian get a nuclear bomb, don't we have the right to have it also as Arabs?
If Iran gets the nuclear bomb, does Saudi Arabia and other countries have the right to get it? I mean, to me, the thought of unimpeded nuclear proliferation in this region is really creates anxiety. I mean, that I think is very, very worrying. So the point is to be able to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. And to me, therefore, I mean, the logic of that is, well, there is an agreement which has a time limit on it. Now we need to work to see what are the conditions under which that can be extended, and that can be taken further forward. Certainly, if Iran does get the nuclear bomb, all kinds of responses and reactions will come, and one would find a lot of sympathy with those. But at the moment, in the case of North Korea has nuclear weapons, and while there is an active discussion in South Korea, and even in Japan, which after all is the country which has been the victim of nuclear weapons being used against it in 1945, there's also a discussion there. But at the moment, those governments are not moving to get nuclear weapons, even though there is a regime which is very unpleasant, in control now of a small number of nuclear weapons. So I think I think these things can be thought through a little, in a little bit of depth before any such decision is approached.
طيب عندنا 10 دقائق بناخذ 3 أسئلة فقط ويجاوبهم الدكتور دان.
We as citizens of the world, we are very concerned about this build-up of force around the world that's not using the mind force as much as the weapon force. Now, why is the United Nations not starting to solve all the tensions around the world without having these countries in need of using weapon as a solution for their problems or neighboring problems? I think this organization have to work hard to begin a mind control around the world instead of weapon control. And the mass destruction is getting built up highly, and it's threatening the civilizations of mankind. And in the future, we have a problem for the next generations that might find these treasures of weapon and use it the wrong way. Thank you.
The UN is a wonderful institution, and it is capable of a lot of things, especially in terms of bringing people together, bringing governments together, whatever their views are about each other, and providing a forum in which they can exchange, in which they can address problems, and sometimes find surprising degrees of consensus and agreement about that. So, for example, the United Nations was the forum through which all the world's leaders have signed up for the Agenda 2030, the global development agenda with the sustainable development goals from now to 2030, with targets including to eradicate all extreme poverty and leave no one behind. So the UN is a wonderful institution and is capable of a lot, but it's only as good as the member states who make it up. So it is back with the member states, and as far as possible then it's back with the governments and with the people to really be addressing and resolving these kinds of situations. And yes, there is a refreshing of the political agendas worldwide, which is needed in order to address these big questions. And as I said right from the outset, my belief is that the emphasis has to be on cooperation. The world needs cooperation now more than it has ever needed it. And the difficulty that we face, which I think will be short term, but the difficulty is that at the moment cooperation is more complicated than it was in the 1990s or the first decade of this century.
Okay, we'll direct to ladies. Maybe you have peaceful solution from ladies. Okay.
I thought we're the cause of all the problems, aren't we? Anyway, thanks, Dan, for coming. It's been a very interesting lecture. You hinted to Europe somewhere in there, and as we know historically, Europe has been, the father of all wars and the cause of all, probably a lot of the problems we're facing today. So why is it taking a back seat now? Why is it letting the others, forefront and making all the decisions?
You keep on asking these very big questions. To try to be brief, Britain was at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution, also at the forefront of the process of creating nation states in the modern sense. The rest of Europe was quick to follow on because nobody could tolerate allowing the Brits to get too far ahead. It's irritating for everyone. I understand that. In that circumstance, it was a slightly pre-industrial revolution, but a modernly organized army that essentially announced the end of the great era of the Middle East, when Napoleon, in a sideshow from the main European war, took a sideswipe at Egypt and just changed things with a single battle. And didn't really pay it that much attention. He wasn't very interested. He left within a few months. So at that point, Europe just had the capacity and it used that capacity. It had the energy, but it wasn't, perhaps I should refine the question a bit and the answer, it wasn't Europe that had it. It was Britain had it, France had it. Once Germany was united, Germany had it. Right? Spain had, to a considerable degree, had it from the 1500s onwards. And that cycle, that has run out. So these countries are not, they're not negligible. They're important, they're powerful. They're still amongst the top 10 industrial producers in the world, the top 10 economies in the world. They're still rich and they're still growing in many different ways. But relatively speaking to what has happened in the rest of the world, they are less. So Germany, France and Britain can really only be big world players if they are together in that. And that means the European Union getting together in that. Now, all through the European Union years, since the early 1990s, there's been the aspiration to be acting together, but actually it remains a union of nation states, and those individual governments have their interests and their logic, and that persistently erodes that collective action. When Europe is able to act collectively, you see it having a real impact. And now, of course, Britain has gone and made that more complicated by the Brexit vote. So we see how that turns out. It's possible, it's perfectly possible that actually Europe in a couple of years will emerge as capable of being a more decisive world actor, which I would welcome, precisely because the complicating factor of the British has removed. Yeah. But I think that these are big historical trends, and it's not because of one politician has got it wrong or one government has made a mistake or something. These are big historical cycles which you touch on with your question.
Thank you.
I think this is the last question.
Maybe I'll ask this question.
The last question. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, for this very clear exposition of ideas. I have two very brief questions. On Korea, I remember that President Trump at one point suggested he would be ready to directly negotiate. I think this was refused, though, clearly, with the experiments which unfollowed. Do you think that the regime in Pyongyang has any will to negotiate, or are they just stalling because they want to arrive at a certain level of technology? On Iran, I'm a little bit more ignorant, but I participated very actively in the creation of the JCPOA. What I don't understand is if they renounce to the atomic weapon, or they declare that they want to renounce to any kind of atomic weapon, why are they developing a ballistic missile? You don't shoot conventional weapons with ballistic missile. It's a waste. So I just want your opinion on this. So maybe it's just my ignorance. Thank you.
Well, I think there are actually plenty of ballistic missiles of different ranges which do have conventional warheads on and can be quite powerful warheads. But you're right, it does seem a strange combination, and I think there's always been reasons to think that Iran may have the ambition to be developing nuclear weapons, and it was not irrational to be concerned about the uranium enrichment program. But I think at the moment that part of the ambition is contained. In the sense it's restricted. And so that, to me, gives the opening to go further. But I agree, the missiles are a troubling part of the picture. On North Korea, I think that in part there has been a problem of timing. It's a little bit, it's uncertain to describe this because one doesn't really know what the thinking is certainly in Pyongyang, but nor even really completely in the White House or as between the White House and the State Department in the US. But it seems to be that there was a point earlier this year when actually both sides wanted contact, wanted talks, and there was willingness. I mean, there was willingness to have such a meeting in New York, and there was contacts of different kind that happened elsewhere. And there was also a visit by Joseph Yun, the State Department Special Envoy, to Pyongyang at the time of the Otto Warmbier, when he was released and then died, the American prisoner. So there were contacts going on, but it was as if each side wanted to have said or done the last thing that was firm and strong before then being able to talk. And they couldn't get that, if you like, you could call it choreography. They couldn't get the timing of those moves right, and they were unable to have in-depth preliminary discussions to figure out how to do that. If you go back into the history of, Nixon going to China, or the beginning of détente between US and USSR, or to other moves leading towards the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe in the 1970s, there were persistently these efforts to get the timing right. And that I think is a big part of what the issue is. I think at the moment that North Korea has very firmly decided that its position will be stronger once it has got it to a certain point in its missile testing and its nuclear weapons testing. And when it's got to that point, then it will be willing to talk. Whether the US is willing to talk at that point will be another question. So because they got the timing wrong in the first half of this year, I think it's got more difficult now. I was asked one other question, if I can just quickly, just a couple of moments. What country is now considered to be the most secure country in the whole world? Sweden, obviously. Of course. And it's asked what city is the most secured in the whole world, and of course it's Stockholm, which is where I live. It's no coincidence, you know. Thank you very much.
Would like to thank Don Smith for his wonderful presentation, hopefully meeting him later, and would like to thank King Faisal Center for giving us this chance, and thank you all.